This is the Discontinuity Thesis, a 7-part series on why AI breaks the wage-demand circuit that post-war capitalism depends on. Written by Ben Liurongs. Episode 6: The Successor System. The question in this episode is why redistribution and public ownership can preserve consumption without preserving wage capitalism. The previous episode closed the regulatory route. Category-based instruments cannot defend the wage-demand circuit because the deployed object migrates between categories faster than categories can be redrawn. The successor system can deliver consumption, it cannot deliver the wage-demand circuit. Hold that distinction for the rest of this episode. The honest reader's next move after accepting that regulation fails is to reach for the alternatives: direct ownership of the compute layer, mandatory wage share redistribution from automation gains, public deployment of the technology with non-market allocation rules, sovereign AI funds, national compute dividends, nationalization of frontier labs. These sit outside the categorical paradigm. They operate on the value flow rather than the deployed object. They are the right kind of intervention. They also do not save the wage-demand circuit, they save consumption. The two are not the same object. That distinction matters because the wage-demand circuit was never only a way to distribute purchasing power. It was a way to distribute agency, bargaining power, status, mobility, and democratic leverage through productive necessity. Redistribution can replace the income, it cannot replace the necessity. This is the episode that closes the last exit. Let me begin with the conflation that needs to break. The wage-demand circuit is a specific mechanism. It is the feedback loop in which production generates wages, wages generate consumption, consumption generates production, production generates labor demand. The circuit is closed, each leg supports the others. Mass economic agency is internal to the circuit because the population's purchasing power is generated by its own productive activity. Consumption via redistribution is a different mechanism. Production generates revenue. Revenue is taxed or claimed by the state distributes the proceeds as transfers. Recipients consume. Consumption generates further production. The circuit closes, but it closes through the state. The population's purchasing power is generated by political allocation rather than productive activity. These are not minor variations on the same system. They are different systems with different stability properties, different political economies, different distributions of agency. The thesis is not that the second system cannot exist, it is that the second system is not the first system. The question of whether post-war capitalism survives is the question of whether the first system survives. It does not. The obvious objection is that post-war capitalism already contained redistribution. Welfare states, public health care, pensions, unemployment insurance, tax credits, housing subsidies, public education all redistributed purchasing power outside the immediate wage relation. So AI redistribution is not a successor system, it is more welfare state capitalism. This misses the distinction between supplement and replacement. In the post-war settlement, redistribution supplemented a labor market that remained the primary generator of mass purchasing power. The wage was still the center. Transfers stabilized the circuit. They did not constitute it. Most working-age adults received most of their income, status, recognized social role, and political standing through their participation in production. The welfare state caught those who fell out of the wage circuit. It did not replace the circuit. A post-AI redistribution regime is different. It does not stabilize a wage circuit that remains primary. It replaces the wage circuit as the source of mass demand. That is the discontinuity. The question is not whether the state distributes some income. The question is whether most people receive purchasing power because their labor is economically necessary, or because the political system allocates them a claim on automated surplus. The threshold is not redistribution, it is the centrality of redistribution. When transfers stop being the catch and start being the floor, the system has changed even if every institutional name stays the same. Take the alternatives at their best. Direct ownership of the compute layer means the state owns or controls the data centers, the chips, the training runs, the deployed models, the inference capacity. Private actors lease access. Rents flow to the public balance sheet rather than to private equity. This is genuinely outside the categorical paradigm because the state is no longer regulating an object, it owns the object. Mandatory wage share redistribution from automation gains means the state requires firms to maintain a target ratio between labor compensation and total value added. As AI displaces workers, the firm either retains them at sustaining wages or pays the difference into a redistribution pool. Public deployment with non-market allocation means the state deploys AI itself for public purposes. Output allocated by need or political process rather than by price. Each of these is a real intervention, each operates outside the categorical paradigm, each can in principle sustain mass consumption indefinitely. The thesis does not deny this, the thesis observes what the interventions do not preserve. Now the trickiest case, mandatory wage share redistribution. A critic could say if firms are forced to maintain labor compensation, then the wage demand circuit survives, wages still exist, workers still get paid through payroll, the mechanism looks identical to the post-war circuit. It is not. Mandatory wage share preserves the wage form, not the wage mechanism. A wage generated by productive necessity is different from a wage maintained by political obligation after the worker has ceased to be necessary to production. The first is labor income. The second is a transfer routed through payroll. It may be desirable, it may be stabilizing, it may be morally necessary. It is not the old circuit surviving. It is the successor system wearing the wage as an administrative costume. The diagnostic is whether the wage tracks productive necessity or political mandate. If the firm would pay the worker absent regulatory compulsion, the wage is real. If the firm pays the worker only because the state requires it, the payment is a transfer with a misleading label. Both deliver income, only the first is the wage demand circuit. This matters because synthetic wages have different stability properties from real ones. Real wages are defended by the firm's need for labor. Synthetic wages are defended only by the political will that mandates them. Political will is exposed to elections, lobbying, fiscal crises, and competitive pressure from jurisdictions that do not impose the mandate. What does the wage demand circuit have that the successor system lacks? The circuit had three properties beyond mere consumption. The first is that economic agency was distributed by the same mechanism that distributed purchasing power. To earn was to participate in the productive system. The act of selling labor gave the worker a role in the system that produced what they consumed. This produced political leverage. Strikes mattered because withdrawing labor withdrew production. Bargaining mattered because the firm needed the worker as much as the worker needed the firm. Recipients of state allocation retain political leverage. They can vote, protest, organize, riot, withdraw legitimacy. These are real forms of power. They are not the same as labor leverage. Labor leverage works because production requires the worker. Recipient leverage works because rule requires consent or at least social peace. A worker strike stops production, a recipient strike does not. The successor citizen may have political power, they do not have the same economic power. The second property is that the wage was a price signal that allocated talent, effort, and ambition across the economy. People moved into productive activity because it paid. Under redistributive successors, this signal weakens or disappears. The third property is that the wage demand circuit was institutionally stabilizable because displaced workers could be reabsorbed into productive employment. Under redistributive successors, this assumption weakens. There is no labor market capable of mass reabsorption to repair, expand, or redirect, because the productive role of mass labor is no longer the basis of income distribution. The threshold is majority agency. The threshold is not the last worker. There will always be residual human work: protected work, artisanal work, trust-bearing work, care work, political work, luxury human service, legally mandated human presence. Residual labor does not preserve a system built on mass productive participation. Post-war capitalism dies when wage labor no longer provides mass economic agency because a majority of working-age adults cannot sell labor at socially sustaining wages without subsidy, protection, artificial scarcity, makework, or political intervention. Not total labor extinction, mass agency collapse, not consumption, productive participation. This threshold matters because it closes the residual work dodge. Critics often respond by pointing at remaining human jobs. Some humans will always work. Kings had servants, aristocracies had artisans, feudal societies had labor. The existence of residual human work does not preserve a system built on mass productive participation. There is a political economy problem with installing the successor system that has not been addressed yet. The structural alternatives all require the state to expropriate, tax, or directly control the most economically valuable infrastructure of the era. This is a major political act. It requires popular pressure sufficient to overcome yawning interests or elite consensus that the alternative to expropriation is worse. Popular pressure sufficient for this requires mass economic leverage. Mass economic leverage requires the wage demand circuit. The political conditions to install the successor system are produced by the system the successor is meant to replace. This is the asymmetry. Destruction is automatic, construction is political. The political conditions for construction degrade as destruction proceeds. Elite consensus is theoretically available without popular pressure. It would require yawning interests to recognize that their long-run survival depends on the survival of the consumption base that purchases their output. There are historical precedents for elite consensus of this kind. There are also historical precedents for the absence of such consensus. The diagnosis is separate from the forecast. Even under ideal installation, structural alternatives preserve consumption rather than the circuit. That is the structural claim. It does not depend on any prediction about implementation. There is also an endpoint stability problem. Stipulate that the structural alternative has been installed: universal basic income funded by AI capital, citizen-owned compute, nationalized frontier AI, a sovereign AI fund, a post-work cultural society. Choose the version the optimist prefers. The question is whether that destination stays. It does not. The same competitive forces that drove the transition continue operating after the transition. A universal basic income equilibrium requires persistent taxation across jurisdictions competing for AI capital. Capital is mobile. Tax competition pulls rates downward. The absent wage circuit removes the mass economic base that historically defended progressive taxation. A universal basic capital equilibrium requires distributed ownership to stay distributed across generations. Power law dynamics, liquidity preference, and foreign capital push ownership back toward concentration. A state socialist equilibrium with nationalized frontier AI must outcompete private states on capability and productivity. It either adopts private sector AI development structures, accepts relative decline, or suppresses competition by force. A post-work cultural meaning society still requires a political economy substrate that pays for the compute. The cultural layer does not decide which substrate is selected. Fragmented localism is stable for small population fractions inside a tolerant larger system. It is not a mass absorption channel. The stable configurations are stable for a structural reason. Either competition has been removed by hegemonic enforcement, which means a singleton, or competition has selected for an inegalitarian equilibrium, which means neo-feudalism, a small elite of compute owners, a verifier class, and a large dependent population. The optimist imagines a cooperative endpoint and then freezes it, but configurations do not hold just because they are desirable. Status competition reorganizes around whatever scarce resource remains valuable once labor scarcity has been removed. That is why the honest question is not simply what comes after, it is which stable configuration society arrives at and on whose terms. Let me bring this together. Post-war capitalism rested on a wage-demand circuit in which mass productive participation generated the income that sustained mass consumption. AI severs this circuit by making mass productive participation economically unnecessary. Unit cost dominance ensures the severance happens at the task level. Interface collapse propagates it. Coordination impossibility ensures no actor can stop it. The Sorites principle and categorical recursion ensure regulation cannot route around it. The structural alternatives can preserve consumption, they cannot reconstitute the circuit. What replaces the circuit is a successor system in which the population's purchasing power is generated by political allocation rather than by productive activity. The successor system is not necessarily worse on every dimension. It may be more equitable, it may be more humane, it may produce better outcomes for the median citizen than late-stage rentier capitalism would have. It may also be more authoritarian, more fragile, more dependent on the goodwill of the owning class, more exposed to political capture. Most of the AI policy debate is conducted as if the question is whether the wage-demand circuit can be saved. The question is not. The wage-demand circuit cannot be saved by any combination of regulation, redistribution, ownership, or coordination, because the underlying mechanism that generated it has been removed. The real question is which successor system arrives, who designs it, and on whose terms. This is a different debate. It does not benefit from being conducted in the vocabulary of labor market policy. It is a debate about the constitutional design of a post-wage economy. It should be conducted in that vocabulary. The structural alternatives are not rescues, they are options for the successor. Direct ownership of compute is one constitutional choice, mandatory wage share redistribution is another, public deployment with non-market allocation is a third. Each produces a different political economy, each redistributes power differently, each has different stability properties, different failure modes, different relationships to democratic agency. Choosing among them is the actual decision the polity faces. Pretending that any of them preserves the system that preceded them is the move that prevents the decision from being made. It is the move that ensures the successor is designed by default, by the actors with the most leverage, under the conditions most convenient to them, and at the moment of greatest crisis. That is the worst possible design environment. The thesis is a request to stop pretending. The wage-demand circuit is no longer self-reproducing. The successor system is the question. Anyone who refuses to acknowledge this is not defending post-war capitalism. They are ensuring the successor is designed without them. The successor system can deliver consumption. It cannot deliver the wage-demand circuit. The next episode addresses the most sophisticated remaining objection, that friction will provide enough time in enough places to preserve the circuit in modified form. It will not. Drag is not rescue. That is episode 6 of the Discontinuity Thesis. The full essay, transcript and citations are at unitcostdominance.com. Next, drag is not rescue, why friction changes timing without restoring the circuit.